My name is Blake Gifford. I'm an architect, and I've lived and worked in downtown York for the last 7 years. I serve on York's Historic Architectural Review Board, on the History Center's Building and Grounds Committee, and for the last year and a half, I've been sharing my hand-drafted portraits of York's historic buildings under the name York Architecture Illustrated. For as long as I can remember, my identity has been wrapped up in a desire for belonging, namely a sense of community and a sense of place. And for the first 20 years of my life, I often felt disappointed by the search for those things. I never truly loved where I lived. What was my community? What was my place? And who was I within it? See, we moved from Pennsylvania to Texas when I was 5, and I grew up in a suburb of Houston called Cypress. Originally settled in the mid-1800s, Cypress was no more than a wide portion of the highway, a collection of family farms for most of its life. In the town center, there were a few homes, hotels, and even a saloon. That was until the 1970s, when the Arab oil embargo spurred massive growth in Houston's petroleum industry and its small surrounding rural communities. And by the mid-90s, when my family and I moved in, 20 years after the start of that oil boom, we encountered a series of planned communities growing at a mad pace. So as I grew up, searching for my community and my place, the environment of my community was changing dramatically and often traumatically. As a child, there was no way to anticipate whether the dense woods you like to explore or the old farmhouse whose windows you could peer into would actually, literally be there the next time you showed up. So I learned to get used to distrusting my place, constantly anticipating not just change, but loss. The formation of a communal identity was limited to what you could hold on to, which was generally the pre-planned suburb you happened to be able to afford. No main street, no walkable city, just repeated clusters of homes to drive between. And as an aspiring architect, there was only disillusion. Where was the heritage of Cypress's indigenous residents and later German settlers carried out in its architecture and its planning? What common threads could we draw from site to site to learn the story of our place and of ourselves? There were none. The history, the story, was scattered to the wind. In contrast, nearly every year, my family and I would travel to Edinburgh, Pennsylvania for Christmas with relatives. Edinburgh was settled at around the same time as Cypress, but was subject to entirely different circumstances. No oil boom, no developed metropolitan area, just a late colonial village built around a mill with a small college campus. As such, scattered around the town are these individual moments of natural and built beauty. The pizza place, the taverns, the churches, even the shopping mall are all still tied together by the centuries-old practical intent of the town's settlers, a human-scale, walkable village radiating outward from the flour mill at the creek crossing. So every time we had to leave Edinburgh and return to Cypress, I felt like I had left a piece of myself up there. The identity that I was forming was split between two places, and I felt disconnected from both. My house, family, and friends were in an environment that felt inorganic and psychologically oppressive, while the community I identified with was out of reach. Luckily, we were able to move after high school, and I was able to start architecture school. Now I was being exposed to urban design and other related subjects. I was learning about the different approaches to city layouts, the negative effects of suburban sprawl, and I finally felt like I could understand in part why I felt so disconnected from the place where I grew up. But I was also able to hone in on what I liked, specifically about so many different places in the Northeast. These colonial and early 20th century towns, early 19th century towns and cities, in first being designed at that human scale, how far one can walk rather than drive, seem to physically foster more accessible, equitable communities within them. And I noticed that if that original framework is preserved, if history is kind and allows for development to be regulated, the cultural identities of different districts and neighborhoods to be maintained, urban cores and historic density to be bypassed by highways and interstate construction instead of being destroyed by them, what survives are countless moments of beauty, resting on foundations centuries old and contributing to a collective sense of place, a shared communal identity, and a mutual desire to care for those things. In other words, the love of where you live. And I don't really think I truly found that in a place until I found York. But the last piece of the puzzle for me and my craft came actually in the form of dissatisfaction with my job. Here I am, an architect working and living in this beautiful historic downtown, but my projects, fulfilling as they were never actually in town. In many respects, while I was finally happy with the place that I lived, I was still not truly engaging with it. But Art and hand drawing have always had a role in my life in some form. When I was younger, it was often a way of exploring my imagination and my love of Star Wars. Well, as I got older, it became a useful skill for my career. Although it's not used regularly anymore in practice, I took very quickly to hand drafting and its methodical process. So I decided to gather some supplies, and I started drawing, as meticulously as I could, the buildings on the section of East Market Street where I live in York. I used what I had been taught in drafting classes at school, plus some of my own style, to capture detail, shadow, and color as an expression of love toward a place that has finally made me feel at home. What started on a laptop tray has transitioned to a larger drafting table, and I realized that I was beginning to feel connected to York in ways that I hadn't before. Each project I worked on prompted me to learn everything I could about the building and its site, and through this incremental process, I've been able to form a more complete picture of York's story. But even more rewarding than that has been my experience sharing my work with the York community. I'm so incredibly thankful for the overwhelming positivity I've received since starting York Architecture Illustrated, especially since it's a regular reminder of how many others also share the same love of York and its often overlooked beauty. All said and done, though, I'm lucky enough to say that I love where I live. I feel lucky as well that I can shine the right amount of light on some of the things that make York special. I've been able to find in this community an inspiration that I've never really had before. And for all of that, through all of this, I hope I can return the favor. Thank you.